guest podcast today. I haven't done one of these in months, but I reached out to Dr. Cindy Hovington, who I did a podcast with over a year ago. She's been posting amazing content on Instagram. Go follow her. And I said, I need to talk to you again about reflective parenting and give my audience your expertise and share the strategies that you're giving your audience with my audience. And hopefully some of you guys go follow her, buy her stuff, because she's offering amazing things. And she talks about what we talk about here on Rising Father, but she backs it up with studies and backs it up with projects and all kind of scientific information. So this is a guest podcast where I interview Dr. Hovington. We talk about all Rising Father stuff and marriage strategy, self-control, how to stop snapping and be patient with your kids, spanking, and everything we talk about, but she backs it up with neuroscience. So let me read you her bio before we jump right into the interview. Cindy Hovington, PhD, is a neuroscientist and the founder of Curious Neuron, a global platform supporting parental well-being. She helps parents reduce stress, build confidence, connect with their children, and learn how to cope with emotions using science-backed tools. Cindy is also the host of the Reflective Parenting podcast. She works with companies and partners with pediatric clinics in several countries to support parental well-being through her unique reflective parenting program, which teaches parents skills rather than more parenting advice. You can learn more at curiousneuron.com. So let's dive into this interview. You've been posting a ton on reflective parenting. Can you just kind of give us a summary of what is that, what does that mean, and how does that relate to fathers and parents?
Yeah, I've been using that term a lot, and that's what the angle we've been taking at Curious Neuron, and it's because I feel that it encompasses everything that I share with parents around like the nervous system, which we're going to talk a lot about today, and understanding the nervous system. And a lot of parents are reactive based on, how we were raised and, the patterns that our brain has. And parents often ask me, like, how do I stop that? How do I become more responsive to my child rather than reactive? And it's not an easy fix. I wish it was, but it isn't an easy fix. But there is a fix. There is a way to work on ourselves, with that respect. And it's learning how to reflect. And this is not about just like random journaling. This is truly about like thinking back in a strategic way. And there are lots of studies around, it's called reflective functioning, especially with parents. And there are lots of studies that show that even if you come from adversity, you and your child have experienced trauma, when they teach parents how to pause and reflect back, right? So in retrospect, thinking about an event that happened with your child or your partner or somebody else, when you gain those skills, then you are able to eventually learn how to pause and build the right skills to regulate your emotions in those moments. But again, you have to build the self-awareness, right? Like we think about regulating our emotions by just breathing. And if I take deep breaths, like I'll be fine. No, you might still lose your shit. Like it's not going to help you necessarily. But if you know how to pause and think in that moment through your reflective skills, then you'll see a bigger impact. So that's why I've been using that a lot and using that term. And we've called our club the Reflective Parent Club because those are the skills we're helping parents build. So moms and dads, and the insights from dads they've brought like some of the members to tears. Like it's been such a beautiful experience.
What are some of the situations that a parent would get into where they would need to implement the reflective parenting?
Every situation with their kids that are chaotic, right? So I think about, even just validating a child's emotions. Like there's a lot of there are lots of misconceptions around validation, and I'm sure we'll get into detail around that. But when it comes to just pausing, right, and thinking like, okay, what's my child experiencing in this moment? Because if they're having a tantrum or being super rude and disrespectful, our reaction is like, how dare you? Like stop it, right? We want to stop the behavior. We want to discipline them in that moment and show them that like, this is not how you speak to me. But if we reflect and think back to, oh yeah, I did speak to them that way. I did say something a little bit more sharp that could have triggered them. Or I did say something that felt shaming to them, right? Like then we think about what we are adding to this, interaction, and it leads to less dysregulated interactions and more connection with our kids. So any interaction where we automatically have a certain lens of this child is doing this to me, or a threat lens or a perfection lens. When we stop and reflect, that's when we learn to really switch or shift that lens, which is the science of cognitive reappraisal. And we shift the lens, and then we gain a new perspective, whether it's an interaction with our partners or with our kids. It truly helps us to change and see things differently, not minimize and not accept anything that is happening, right? We might still set the boundary, but it doesn't impact us as much in terms of the stress.
Okay, well, I need to set the boundary. I need to have discipline, but at the same time, I need to modify behavior in some way. And for a lot of dads, that is the issue, because there's this thinking of, well, I'm the father. My father just kind of told me what to do and yelled at me, and I did it. What you're describing sounds a little bit more like accountability, a little bit more like ownership. It's reflecting on what is my part into this. So how would you approach a guy who's the father and he was yelled at his whole life? That's how, right now, up to this point, that's his pattern of behavior modification for his kids. It's, I'm going to tell them what to do. They're going to listen because I'm their dad.
Right.
Like, what's step one for him to go from, I control my kids by yelling, to I want to be a little bit more reflective and not maybe scare them so much?
Yeah, well, I always tell a parent to start with themselves, right? So it was interesting, hearing and understanding what a father, or how a father defines discipline. It was more in terms of intrapersonal, so self versus interpersonal. And that truly stood out to me. And I think that when it comes to that word, discipline, we think of like, how disciplined am I to like keep up with my workouts, or, be a certain way in my life. And that's very important. In addition to that, what does that look like when you're with somebody else? Like, how disciplined are we, and how are we modeling what discipline looks like? And so to me, discipline in both of those worlds is your internal dialogue. And so starting with yourself, if you're a dad listening to this, it's when I don't feel like doing something, what's that language like in my head? Is it harsh and belittling and shaming? And is this the kind of voice I want to instill in my child? Because there are different ways to motivate yourself. You don't have to shame yourself and say, sometimes we think of the consequences. If you don't do that, then this will happen, right? Rather, I was actually speaking to a parent yesterday whose child really struggled with doing homework. And she said, well, I keep telling him, like, if you don't do this, you're going to fail. He's in grade 2. And so, sure, yes, that's not wrong. But then I said, how can you kind of switch that to showing him that there's an end goal? What's your end goal? Well, your end goal is that you want to do well in school. How do you get to that end goal? How do we work together as a team? And she related it to his hockey, where he was really getting better at hockey by practicing. And so she started speaking to him that way, rather than like, the threats and the shaming. And it shifted the way that he was learning how to show up for himself. And so back to that dad, this is what I want us to think about today in our conversation. What's the language I want my child to use later on? I don't need them to shame and belittle themselves to do something, to be disciplined. I want them to show up for themselves, and I want them to know that they can do hard things. That can be true without it feeling like it's like you feel shitty if you don't do it.
Have you found that the way the father speaks to himself and thinks about himself is transferred to the way he speaks and thinks about his kid?
Often, yes, in moms and dads, right? Like even I hear language like, my kid's an asshole, or they're such a brat, or they're a pest, right? Like, it seems innocent. And sure, with a friend and you're having a drink and you're like, I had such a shitty day and really like messed everything up today. That's not bad. However, what we want to think about is, and there are studies with teachers as well, where there's a student or two that they really that really triggers them, and so their perception about that child is different. Well, it applies to parents as well. If I have 3 kids, for example, and if one of them is very much like me and that triggers me, right, I might be harder on that kid subconsciously, and I might use different language with that child because of how they trigger me and how I don't want them to be like me, right? And so I do think it's important for parents to address first their inner dialogue, their perceptions of their child. Like, my child is lazy, they don't want to do the work. Well, what if they don't have the skills to motivate themselves? And what if they need to understand what a goal is and how you scaffold your way to the top and make and achieve that goal? What are the skills and tools I can provide my child that is away from fear? here, right? Like there are different ways of getting there. And hopefully in the future, that means my child will be able to do that when in moments I'm not there, because our voice around our kids becomes their inner voice. We all lived it. Like my mom, my dad left us when I was very young. I don't have many good memories of him. And this is part of the reason why I speak about dad so much on Curious Neuron, and I'm part of a men's mental health initiative on the board for that. I truly think that dads are forgotten in the picture of parenting sometimes when there are parenting resources. But more importantly, I don't want kids to be raised in an environment that I was in, where a dad just didn't give a shit about being a dad and was like, no, that's your job, to the mom. And then, yeah.
Yeah, that's hard to hear, but I've heard it too, with a lot of the guys that are in our group and in the community. But it's crazy that you could be talking to a guy in his 50s and 60s, and he still feels that pain of the father who neglected him 40, 50 years ago. I was just on a call with a guy who's 64 years old, and he mentioned to me, like, in his mind, the biggest anchor in his life, still as a 64-year-old man, was, he said, my father, he called it adulted him, where he was like emotionally threw up on him and was judgmental, toxic, and angry towards him. And it just 50 years later, it was still pulling his life down. But luckily, if you're a father listening to this, or that in any of our content, hey, if you're not there yet, you can listen to these things and make the changes. I think the hard part is, it's hard to, whenever we snap or say something we don't want to, it's an emotional reaction at the time.
Right.
It's like, as right now, we're not feeling good, we're tired, hungry, we're upset with our life, whatever the case may be. Our kid does something that irritates us, and we just blow up on them. Or what can somebody do? Like, let's back up before the reflective parenting, before you are in a situation to assess what happens, like the pre-trigger moment. You're in a car driving with your kid, and what's going to happen for 10 minutes from now? My kid's just going to start screaming, punching his sister, and it's going to piss me off, and I'm going to snap. Like, what are some just how to live habits, things, or things a father could do to prep for these situations, to make sure that, okay, when the trigger does happen, I'm less likely to snap?
Well, it's exactly what you just described. So I think in retrospect, at the end of your day, take 3 minutes just to think about emotional interactions that you had that day, or emotional withdrawals, right? So we have a dad who joined the club with his wife, and he was like, I'm here to support her. I was like, okay. And then we kept, every week we had a session. And then it took a couple of sessions for him to realize that he was also dysregulated, because he said, my wife, yells at the kids in the car, that exact example that you gave. And he realized that he was dysregulated because, in a different way, he shut down. And so when they would get home, sure, in the car, he was cool, calm, collected while his wife was yelling at their kids. But then when they got home, he retracted. He went to hide. He went into his room or went into the basement. He would play video games and not interact with the kids, not interact with the wife. That would lead to a lot of conflict. But he just thought he was doing something to bring himself joy, not realizing that his whole nervous system would shut down, not wanting any of the conflict. And so it took, I think, 7 sessions. Like, it really took a long time for him to be that like light bulb moment to happen. And so I think for fathers that are listening, that first part is truly self-awareness. And the only way to build your self-awareness is to collect data. Maybe that's my neuroscience background, but I like collecting data, and that's the way I look at it. They're not failures, they're data. How do we collect enough data to have the evidence that we need? So if you're having a lot of negative or uncomfortable interactions with your partner or with your kids, or one specific kid, okay, at the end of the day, think about what happened, right? So I yelled at them in the car. What was happening? Well, maybe there was a lot of noise, and I hate noise. And by 4 or 5 p.m., I actually like silence. That's part of your nervous system, right? And we don't even think about those needs that we have. For myself, there's touch. When I had very small kids, I had 3 kids in under 4 years. At one point near the end of the day, I didn't even want to have one in my arms. I needed space. I needed my physical bubble to be clear of a human, of a person. I just couldn't. And so it would lead to, when my husband would come home, like this awkwardness of like, don't come close to me. And then he couldn't understand it. And I didn't have the self-awareness. And so I left a notebook on my kitchen island and started writing like things that I was thinking, right? It's not even about emotions. It's truly about my thoughts. And my thoughts were, get off me, right? When one of my kids would pull at my leg, or stop touching me to my baby, or like I was nursing and I'd be like, oh, I don't want to do this right now. And so when I collected enough evidence, I realized, oh crap, like my sensory system is overloaded. And so it's the same thing for dads listening. Start collecting data. You could do it on your phone app, your notes app, use a notebook, or just in your mind if you're good at remembering. I'm not, but if you're good at that, do it that way. And then you're going to start seeing patterns. You're going to start seeing that in certain conflict. There was a dad who said he thought silence during an argument was good because the argument wouldn't be as long. And so his silence was because he grew up in an environment that there was a lot of chaos in argument. And so he wanted to end it as quickly as possible, versus his wife would see that as shutting down and not having the conversation they needed to have. And so they were butting heads during conflict, although he wasn't saying anything. And so he realized that conflict, through his data collection, that in his thoughts, it was, how do I end this now? Agree with her, get it to stop. Great, let's move on. But then he realized that wasn't being fruitful to their relationship. And so I truly think that if a dad starts to collect data, he'll start seeing, where is he shutting down? Where is he exploding? What are the thoughts around that? And then you can take it from there to build the tools and the skills that you need.
Yeah, shutting down is a huge problem with men. It's isolation. It's kind of like you're in an argument with your wife. A lot of guys' first instinct is to leave the house. It's to leave the room.
Sure.
And a lot of from what the fathers tell me, that their wives' first instinct is to kind of like smother the husband and like go towards them. The guys want to kind of go away. Does that have anything to do with nervous system? Because in your content a lot, you talk about like our kids borrow our nervous system. So how does that relate to all this?
Yeah. So in conflict, when you are dysregulated, you can be dysregulated where you have low energy and you shut down and you just want to move away from everything, or you can be dysregulated in a way that your nervous system wants to explode. And so, yes, there are differences in couples, and I think it's about being mindful of the differences. So there was a couple I worked with where one would shut down and one was explosive. I don't want one to become the other, but I want there to be a middle ground, right? Like how does a person that shuts down come a little bit closer to the middle ground of that? So let's say that's blue and explosive is red. In between that is yellow. How do I warm up a little bit in order to get to that more regulated area? And the person who's completely dysregulated and yelling, how do we cool them down a little bit to bring them to that more regulated area, right? So that's the kind of dance that happens in conflict. And there's a beauty in that, because if you and I are in a conflict and I'm in the red zone and you're in the blue zone, I have to get to know you well enough to know what I need to say to you to bring you to that yellow zone of a little bit more regulated, so that you're thinking a little bit better. You're not as stuck in that feeling or space that you are. And you have to know me well enough to know, how do I cool Cindy down and bring her into that middle zone? And so that's the beauty of conflict. It's not bad. And I, again, because of my childhood, I always perceived conflict as bad. It meant that there was going to be an end to the marriage. And so I had to learn a lot about conflict. But when our kids are around us, so if you think about that conflict, any interaction where we're both dysregulated, maybe we're in the red zone and so is our child, that is a conflict, right? And that means that I have to cool myself down first, because when a child is young, especially under the age of 20, sorry to say, but it's long, they are still looking to, well, even more so, let's say 10 and under, but our child is looking towards their external environment to help them regulate their brain. And so if they're in the red zone, we can't expect, and these are unrealistic expectations that we have for our kids. They're 12 years old, they can calm themselves and regulate themselves. No, they're still depending on our nervous system. And so co-regulation is a concept where that child is looking at the external environment for safety, to cool their nervous system down. If we are in the red zone and we are yelling, shaming, belittling, threatening, whatever it is, they will maintain in that red zone because their nervous system is in a mode of threat. I am not safe here. I need to keep myself in that red zone in fight or flight in case I need to fight for myself or run. That's how the nervous system perceives anything in that environment. And so if I know how to regulate myself and catch myself, not to say that any parent or dad will never be in the red zone. We will get there. When you're tired, when you haven't eaten, when you had an argument with your partner and you're still stuck in that argument, you will be more susceptible to getting into that red zone or blue zone, whatever is your zone, right? And so if I can at least have the self-awareness to catch myself telling my child, like, sit down, right? And having a certain language that keeps them in the red zone, then I can catch myself and say, ooh, I'm sorry. That's not how I meant to say it. I can see that you're really upset right now. And so am I. So can we just take 2 minutes? I need to cool myself down a little bit. And then let's have this conversation. That's a reflective parent. And that's a parent who's able to catch themselves and say, this is not working. This is escalating the situation. Every time I'm threatening my child and saying, like, I said, put it away, turn the Nintendo off, right? Whatever it is. Do you want me to take it away from you tomorrow? Just whatever it is in that moment, that's not going to change anything. So that's what I mean by it starts with the parent. And that if we maintain ourselves in that red zone or blue zone, right? Because if I'm shut down, maybe my child will stay shut down. I need to find a way to bring myself to that middle ground of regulated so that I can support my child that way.
So whenever a parent is hot and angry and upset and stressed out, their emotional home and how they feel gets really transferred, it sounds like, to the kid in that moment. Yep. But you're an adult, they're a child, they can't handle it as much. And then what sometimes happens is you're the adult, you're upset, you scream at your kid, and that transfers to them. And then how they handle it in response might be screaming back at you.
Sure.
If you've got an older kid who's more independent. And then sometimes as a parent, we get offended and we think we got to put them in their place. And it kind of just spirals out of control. Any of the fathers that you're working with, have any of them described that type of situation?
Yeah, most of them have younger kids, but they've still seen moments of escalation, right? Where no matter what they're saying, it's just making the situation worse.
Yeah.
And I think especially as you described older kids, my kids are getting older as well. And you get into these situations where the child says something to you and you look at them, you're like, how dare you say that to me? Like, how can you speak to me that way? It's so rude and disrespectful. Did I raise this kind of child? Like, I think you need to know that I'm in charge here. And it's only normal, right? We're going to have those thoughts. But again, that child's brain, again, especially 12 and under, they are more impulsive. They haven't learned the regulation skills that we have. They are looking out at their environment and they haven't developed all of the skills yet to regulate internally. We can, not all of us, but we should be able to a certain point. And so we need to remember that that child might have snapped because they don't have the tools yet to regulate their emotions. Does it mean that we ignore what they said? No, there can still be a boundary set. You don't speak to me that way. That is not how you speak to somebody when you're angry. But then once that happens, what's the conversation that's going to happen in the home, right? What are we doing with our kids after this aftermath of having an argument or conflict that says, look, I can see that you got really upset. And now that I thought about it, I might have said something or maybe my tone was off, but I don't want you to speak to me that way. I would rather you kind of catch me in that moment, of speaking to you that way, because I'm working on that. And so in those moments if I'm rude and disrespectful to you, just catch me, tell me, I will hear you, but let's work together. That is not respect in the home. And I don't want that to be the kind of respect we show each other in the home. And you know what, like even with when my kids were younger, I would tell them, if ever I'm mad at you or really upset and you don't feel loved, let me know. It happened once. It happened once when they were getting ready, they were in the shower, and I absolutely lost my mind because my youngest was spraying. He thought it was really funny to take the shower head and spray the ceiling. And
we're laughing now.
Right, we're laughing now. So in that moment, I just yelled, like, it's enough, stop. And I don't remember how I said it, but I did lose my mind. And he just looked at me and said, Mommy, I don't like the way you said that. And it was true. He was right. But that's because for years before that, I kept saying, if ever you don't feel loved. And the language I used was wrong. It was wrong. And so he brought me down. I was in the red zone. His noticing what was happening brought me back to that middle ground, that yellow zone of like, whoo, shit. Like, sorry, kid, like I shouldn't have said that. I don't want parents and dads to feel that there has to be this idea of perfection, right? You will say things you regret, whether it's in a relationship with your child, your partner, family members. We will get in those moments where we say things and we're like, shouldn't have said it that way. We were dysregulated. But when we learn how to show up for ourselves and for the people around us, we can come back to the conversation and say, it's not what I meant. Let's start this over. It's not what I meant to say. And that's being reflective.
And I think it's great that your child was that comfortable with you that they could tell you that. I think it's a huge sign. This morning we had a call with my group, and a father who's new was telling us about how he snapped this weekend, and his son specifically told him, like, Dad, don't talk to me that way, or why were you so angry? And I said, okay, that's great. Let's learn the lesson. What's the situation? What were the triggers? Okay, this is the weekend's coming up. How can we prepare for that? But also, it's a positive sign that your son was that comfortable with you that he can tell you that, because relationships start to fracture whenever there's cold silence and people are afraid to communicate with each other. You talked about like the emotions of the parents being transferred to the emotions of the kids. What are the actual like neurological effects and studies and all the stuff that happens from let's just say we've got the archetype of the angry, shouting, screaming, mad parent, this imaginary figure out there. What happens to a child who's perpetually in that environment?
Yeah, I'm so happy that you bring that up, because it's truly important to understand the brain, the stress system, and the nervous system and how they all work together. So if you think of a child from the moment they are born, they have an immature stress system and nervous system that's taking in their environment. The environment that they are in is shaping the brain and nervous system and stress system, their stress response. So a 2-month-old that is crying, cortisol levels, their stress hormone is increasing. And then somebody comes, comforts them. You feel the warmth of hands on you, a body. There's eye contact. All of that is bringing the cortisol level back down. That pattern, the consistency of that pattern is what eventually shapes their nervous system. So, for example, if a 2-month-old is crying and somebody shows up and holds them, okay, cortisol goes down. But if for the next 2 months, every time they cry, there's no warmth, there's no comfort, there's nothing, that cortisol will remain elevated for a long period of time. And that that infant does not know how to bring the cortisol back down. And so they maintain elevated cortisol levels. That means that stress system of that child will be an irregular one and more reactive, right? Because they never learned through their external environment, that person, their caregivers, their parents, that's how you feel safe. That's what safe feels like. And this is how you bring your nervous system back down. Fast forward to a 5-year-old. Now they're in an environment where they're still learning how to regulate their nervous system and their stress response, but they're a little bit reactive because of their upbringing, their infancy. So being reactive means that any tone that is different, any new face, so new teacher, for example, right? Any new situation where cortisol levels naturally go up, now they're extremely reactive, and now they're in fight or flight more easily because of their very easily reactive nervous system and stress response. And the only way that a child could kind of externalize this is through behavior. It's not just crying and saying I'm scared. It's like, I'm going to behave a certain way to kind of gain more control of my environment and feel safe. I have to find a way to feel safe. Fast forward to this child being 9 years old. If their environment is very chaotic, shame, belittling, nobody is there to support their nervous system, and they still haven't learned how to do that, that's when you see a lot of behavioral problems. That's when you see a lot of social interactions that are not appropriate for that age, where they still haven't learned what conflict looks like, right? Like how to take somebody else's perception. They should be learning how to do that at 9. They should have empathy, but all of those moments that led to them at that point, including interactions between their parents, if we're telling our child, be empathetic, be compassionate, be kind, be respectful, and we're not showing that in the home, that's still shaping their nervous system. That is shaping their world. And so that's going to lead to very different interactions at school with their friends and so on. And so it comes down to the reactivity of the nervous system. Let's go back to that child being 2 months old. If they were raised where there's a consistency of somebody showing up for them, well, cortisol levels go up, cortisol levels go down. Now they're 2, 3 years old and having tantrums, and their caregivers, their parents, are showing up where they're calm. Great. Cortisol goes up because they're in distress and they're having a tantrum. Cortisol goes down because, hey, this is a safe environment and that person in front of me is a safe person. Then they're 7 years old and behavioral issues are coming up a little bit, but that parent is showing up, setting the boundary, being firm on the boundary. And so I'm super mad as a 7-year-old that you said no to 3 desserts that night. I'm in distress. My cortisol goes up. But my parent is still calm with me, being respectful, and I get that I have to do that, and so cortisol goes down. Well, that child's going to show up very differently as a teenager as well. There's a huge difference in how the stress system responds because of the upbringing and how the parents show up. So if a parent is more reactive, that child's nervous system is going to be more reactive. And I don't want to share this so that parents and dads feel like, crap, like I've messed up my child. No. I think that regardless of your child's age today, there are, maybe if they're teenagers or older, they're going to have to relearn how to understand their nervous system, and you can be there to support them. You can rebuild the connection and the relationship. The most amazing way to build resilience is through connection. And so if you start showing up first for yourself and then for your child, you will rebuild that connection and help them rebuild their nervous system. It's possible. It's never too late. But if your child is very young and you're hearing this, then the more you learn how to regulate, then that will trickle down to them. It's the spillover theory in research. What we show and how we show up will spill over to our kids.
To sum that up, it's a child's future ability to handle stress as an adult and the effect of stress on their life as a massive impact or is a massive result of the stressful environment that they're in right now growing up with the parents. So me as a parent, my ability to handle stress and the emotional home I'm creating will kind of determine the future of my child's future emotional state.
Exactly. Well said. It's a lot of pressure for parents.
Yeah, it is, but that's the job we kind of signed up for. And but I like that you said take care of you and then take care of the kids. What did you mean by take care of you?
Yeah, because it's very hard to show up for your child when you're dysregulated, and if your language in your head is, why is this kid doing this to me? Or, even in an argument with an adult, it's like they're so, if your language is negative towards that person or towards yourself, then you will really struggle to build those relationships in a healthy way. Again, I'm thinking of conflict, right? Like we all have lenses in a certain situation. You can have the lens, even the lens of perfection, right? We can be hard on ourselves in situations because we have the lens of perfection versus the lens of self-compassion. I'm not there yet. You used that word before, and I think we need to use that with ourselves as parents. I want to become that parent that isn't as reactive. Great. I'm going to start collecting data. I'm going to do tiny experiments and start working on what that looks like. I'm going to mess up sometimes. I'm going to do well other times. It's not a linear path. And so I want parents and dads to really understand that, working on yourself is a lot of work. It takes time. It takes practice. It takes messing things up and then getting back on it and trying again. And that's part of it. But you can't do that without being honest, with yourself. Like it's, I know it's a cliche, but we have to start. That's the self-awareness piece. Like, oh yeah, I get really defensive in an argument. That was part of my own self-awareness with my husband. And it's like, okay, why? Or what's going on that leads to that? Okay, what's my perception around him saying something that's a little critical, but saying it in a nice way, but I'm hearing it very differently. He's saying it in the way that is right, but I didn't hear it that way. And so really being honest with ourselves. And hearing what our partner has to say, truly listening. We're great. I always laugh at people who talk about how do you have a successful marriage? And they say communication. Sure, great. What's communication? It's more listening than talking. And listening is really hard. And so listening means that, and my husband and I are still working on that, right? There's moments where we won't listen to ourselves, right? Like each other, sorry. We're going to be in conflict and it's going to be like, yeah, well, you did this and you did that. And then we have to step back and be like, hold on a second, this isn't working. And we've learned what that looks like and how to notice our signs. And we're getting to know each other. It's 16 years of marriage, but we're still getting to understand each other because I'm always evolving and so is he. And so as we keep evolving individually, we're going to keep evolving growing together as a couple. But it just, that's what it means to start working on yourself. It's getting to know yourself.
Yeah, and part of accountability and ownership, and what we're talking about is, it's a kind of it can be a painful thing, but so is all growth. It's not like whenever you hear people talk about this, like on this podcast or either of us or anyone, it's you can hear this information and say, you can get offended and shut it off, or you can say, no, I'm human, I make mistakes. I can get better as a father. I want to make my family feel better today. So because of that, I'm going to use the information. I'm not perfect. No one here is perfect. But every single one of us today wants to make our family feel better. So let's first be honest with ourselves. I'm not perfect. These are the things I need to do to fix, and then take the information. That can be really hard for us guys to do. You're getting some feedback, you're doing some journaling, you're being reflective with yourself. All right, I need to make a change today. So whenever you're hearing this, just put the ego aside, just let it soak in. What are some of the actual, like we talked about the emotional symptoms of an unregulated angry dad. Is there any actual physical brain development changes that happen from growing up in that environment? You talked about cortisol or some things. Does anything actually physically change that looks different in the brain of a kid who's raised in that environment?
Yeah, so it's their connections between the frontal lobe and the amygdala. So the prefrontal cortex behind our forehead, that's the thinking part of the brain, the rational part of the brain. And what happens is that when we have a big emotion, and again, I want to emphasize that a big emotion is not the same for everybody. My big emotion could be explosive, your big emotion could be shutting down, right? So everyone is different. And that big emotion, whether it's shutting down or explosive, means that there isn't that strong connection between the frontal lobe. The body and brain is attributing all of the energy that it needs to maintain that emotion. And so if we get stuck in that emotion, which is what emotion regulation skills are, and I use this language with my kids too, when we get stuck, we are stuck. We are stuck in that lens and whatever we are perceiving. And it's almost like if you think of those professional cameras, like a lens, right? You zoom into one little thing. So if you were to zoom into just the microphone, you wouldn't see my entire environment, right? You wouldn't see that I'm there. You wouldn't see that there's a bookcase behind me. But we do that sometimes with our perception, and we forget to zoom out to get more information. And so that ability is the frontal cortex. And if we're stuck in an emotion that's very intense, we can't do that. And so that environment that a child is in will shape how that brain develops, and those patterns. Again, it comes down to that nervous system. But when that stress response is elevated and emotions are high, then that prefrontal cortex isn't jumping into that. And so that's the pattern of somebody who gets stuck and really struggles to rationalize and think and take somebody's perspective. Their brain hasn't been developed to do that. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't ever develop it, but it's going to take work and practice to get there.
It's something that I know a lot of us don't think about, is that I'm feeling this way today. I said this thing to my kid. It's going to eventually have an actual physical impact on their brain and change it. One thing I wanted to get to was you talked about praising effort versus praising results and the difference that has on the outcome. I think your example was you posted like telling a kid you're smart can be counterproductive because it makes ability seem fixed. Can you describe kind of the science behind praising effort and identity and how that kind of forges resilience?
Right. So that's around Dr. Dweck's, Carol Dweck's work. And it's truly, we can use this for a sport, right? So my kids started playing soccer this summer, and there were some parents that you can see those parents on the sideline where it's like, score a goal, just score the goal. And, my kids were starting to think that was the whole point. And we had to have the conversation around teamwork. What does that look like? You want your team to score, sure. But what does that look like in terms of your role there? And what skills do you need to develop to get there? And so one of my three kids, bless him, he tried his best. It's not his sport. He really tried.
That happens.
It's just, it wasn't for him. But he never gave up. And what I would do with my three kids at the end of their soccer game is we'd have a conversation of, what have you been getting better at? And what is something that you still need to work on? And so that was my way of introducing to my kids the growth mindset. Because sometimes it's easy to say, I suck at soccer, right? And we're going to have kids that are going to say that. I'm not good at math. I'm not good at English or writing. I hate it. I hate reading, whatever it is. And it's like, how do we zoom away again? That concept of like not going into one thing, but zooming back and saying, okay, Sure, math is something you struggle with. Not denying that. It's something that you are working on. But what are other things? Like you're like sometimes our kids, even us, like we say, I'm just not good at everything, right? Like it's we put it to every single thing that we do. And so it's like, okay, you're struggling in math. It's a challenge for you. There's nothing wrong with that. What is it that you would like to achieve in math? Well, I'm getting, 60s. Okay, what's your goal? What would you like to get? What would make you feel proud? As a parent, we know we want them to get really good grades, but we want them to build the skill of saying, actually, I'd be happy if I can get a 75 or like a 70 on great. Okay, what do you need to do to get there? Well, let's just look at your other exam. Okay, you got this many mistakes that led to a 62. You want a 75? All right. How many more questions you need to get right? Oh, I only need 3, 4, whatever it is. Okay, so what does that mean now what are the ones that you got wrong? Well, I got the subtractions wrong. Addition was great, but subtract, okay. So that means you don't even have to practice additions. You're doing well, but you're struggling on the subtractions. It's not math overall. It's the subtractions. Let's practice it. Let's do 3 extra ones every night to see if that leads to a better grade or your grade of 75 next week. And that's what I mean by breaking it down, whether it's for a kid or even for ourselves, right? We place it as I'm not a good parent and I'm really failing at this like fatherhood or motherhood thing. No, let's zoom out a little bit. Okay, you're reacting, sure, but you're nurturing your kids, you're doing activities with them, you're spending time with them. But then when you're tired and you're hungry and you had an argument with your husband or your wife, you're really upset and so you're more reactive. Okay, then that's where you need to do your work, right? You need to work on better conflict and better arguments with your partner. And that's what leads to a growth mindset. It's not like an end all thing. It's what do I need to work on? And there's a lot of research around that. There was a researcher at Harvard that talked about this should be part of our school curriculum. I'm in Montreal, Canada, and it's you get a grade on a test, and that's your grade. You're either good or you're not, and it shouldn't be that way. That is not leading to growth mindset. It should be like, hey, you did better on your addition, your subtractions this week. Good job, and you're still really good at addition. That's your grade, right? To a certain extent with young kids, but that's what helps with the growth mindset.
I'm working on this with my daughter. She's a perfectionist.
That's hard. Yeah.
Yeah, my son is not. He's very creative. He's very athletic and does stuff like that. Hilarious. Accomplished in other areas. He gets good grades, but Lauren is like, if I get a 99%, it's an issue.
Right.
She was in my office the other day in tears. I was like, what happened? Did you break a leg? She's like, no, this practice worksheet that I don't have to do, that I have to do on my iPad for school, that my teacher wants me to do as an extra thing, I got 2 wrong. And if I don't get 10 in a row correct, 10 days in a row correct, then I'm not going to get this sticker on the board that doesn't matter. Like, that's basically what it was. She had this huge thing built up in her head that getting a 10 out of 10 on this thing was kind of like defining her so much, and it put her in tears. And I was like, okay, this is something for me to start working on. Like, I don't want her to not get good grades. I want her to know that it's okay if she doesn't. And that doesn't mean like I want her to get into a good college and be accomplished and do that. But what's far more damaging in my mind than a kid who doesn't get an A is a kid who thinks, if I don't get an A, there's something wrong with me.
Of course.
Yeah. So I really want to try to guide her against that. Is this tied at all into like the perfectionism of seeking results? Did it tie there?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that, oh wait, you said a word just now, defining, right?
Yeah.
And so, and that's another thing, right? Like that's another conversation to have with our kids. Does this grade or this sticker define you? Like what is it? What does it mean? Who else are you, right? Is she into a certain sport? Is she a musician of some sort? Like these are all parts of you, and this is a very small part. And that's what we have to remind our kids. Like sometimes there's a sport that they're in and it defines them. And there's nothing wrong with that, but if it leads to them feeling like anything less than a perfection, a perfect score or a good game or playing a certain way, if anything less than that leads to it's the end of the world, then there needs to be a conversation.
Yeah.
Because it's hard. It's not easy, and we want them to be okay with failure. There's there's a book called The Gift of Failure by Jessica Leahy, and it's a really interesting book because it just reminds us that we want our kids to fail in a loving way, not in a negative way, but they need that resilience will come from that. It's part of, and there's small failures usually with kids, right? Like with your daughter, it's a small failure in the big picture. This is nothing really, but to her, it's everything. And so validating, that's another important part, right? Validation is so important. I see how important this is to you. Okay, you got two mistakes or whatever it is. What can you work on next time? Or, what's the expectation too? Like there's the outcome. Yes. What if you don't get it? Let's just already start entertaining the idea of not getting it. What would that mean? What would it lead to? What would be the worst thing that can happen? So when a child gets stuck in that idea of perfection, have them entertain the other option. Like what can fail? What is something you might not be able to control? Okay, but what can you influence in that situation, right? And so it's so tricky with kids, especially around the school age, like in elementary school, because they can get hard on themselves, and it's not easy.
That's what we had to do. I said, let's take this to the worst possible scenario.
Right.
So I was like, Lauren, what if you did none of these practice exams for an entire week? Unthinkable. I was like, what would actually happen? Would your teacher bring you up to the front of the class and yell at you, or would nothing be said? She's like, well, I guess nothing, but I still want to, like, she wants to do that.
Yeah.
And you brought up the next thing I wanted to say. You said validating a child's feelings before correcting their behavior. I think you mentioned like a child's brain needs to feel heard before it can think clearly. Something along those lines.
Yeah.
Like, can you explain that?
Yeah, well, it comes back to the nervous system. So validation is a tool that we should all understand, but there's a huge misconception. So whether it's in an argument with our partners or an argument or a moment with our kid, validating is not accepting what is being said or allowing
Yeah, because the
them,
guys will
right?
hear this and they'll think like, no, that's coddling. I don't do that.
Yeah, it's a huge misconception. Okay, so let's say you and I are in a heated argument and you're trying to prove a point that I don't agree with, but I see that it's really leading to you feeling upset. Think about if I say, Chris, I don't really agree with you, but I can see how upset you are. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that I see how upset you are. I'm not there yet. I don't understand the reason why, but I can see that it's really leading to you feeling angry. How would you feel in that moment, right? Even if I'm not understanding you, or even if we're disagreeing in that moment, it lowers, remember what we were talking about before in terms of like the red zone, the blue and red zone, and then the in-between yellow zone. So if you were in the red zone and I say that to you, it's literally bringing down the nervous system to a little bit more closer to that yellow zone. It's cooling you down. Even if you're you're shut down and you're in an argument and I say, "Oh, you're not here right now. We're having this argument. I see that you're not here. I'm not sure what I said yet, but I can see that you're shutting down. I want to help you get to a place where we can have a conversation," right? So once I said this exact thing to a mom who would yell at her husband for not yelling, yell at him, belittle him, and shame him. What's wrong with you? Why can't you talk? And she hadn't realized that her language was pushing him further into that blue zone. Yeah. And so the language of validating that right now he was shut down, right? You're just saying, I see you. That is what validation is. I see you. And when you do that, whether it's with another adult or your child, feeling seen is what supports that nervous system and feeling more regulated and feeling safe. And so you're going to bring down the stress levels. You're going to bring down that nervous system's feeling of unsafety, and you will have a more fruitful conversation with whatever person you're with. And so it is not coddling. We need to get that out of our mind. It truly isn't. It is, how can we, it's like a special tool, right? Like I wish I had a cooler word for it, but it's truly
it's a weapon you can employ.
Yeah.
A masculine word, it's a weapon you can employ to diffuse the situation, diffuse the bomb.
Let's keep it at that. That's exactly what it is. But it's true. It really helps.
It's like a tool for your toolkit you can use to de-escalate the situation. It's the same reason whenever you're at a customer service place on the phone, they're like, I understand you're upset about that, but they say it in a way that enrages
you. Yeah. Sometimes the tone matters.
Yes,
it's going to take practice. It's going to take practice because what you just said, right, in a situation where you're extremely heated and somebody says, oh no, this is not validation, like calm down. That's not going to
Yeah.
help, right? And so, and again, coming from a stranger, sometimes it doesn't help. But with somebody you care about, if they're validating it, it supports that conflict to kind of like cool down a bit.
Let's end with some actionable blueprint stuff here from you. So I got some examples. Your child comes to you this morning, they come home from school and they say, I'm a bad kid. So you're like, what? Where did this come from? I thought you were a happy, funny, great kid. So what's like a couple step response a father could use in that exact moment?
Get curious, right? Our initial reaction, and I've done this with my kids, like I'm a bad kid or I'm not smart or those are the ones that have come up. Your reaction could be, or I'm not, or even kids saying I'm not good looking, right? Like I'm ugly, right? If they heard something at school or something that happened, our reaction is always to say, no, you're not. You're beautiful. You're a good looking kid. You're smart. You're great. You're amazing, right? It's our reaction to these kinds of situations, but in the end, that's not going to help because what you want to get down to the core of is why is that child feeling this way? And so get them to speak. Get curious. What do you mean by that? Well, one of my friends, her son would get made fun of for his ears. They were a little bit larger, and so the kids at school would call him Dumbo. And so he said, Mom, I'm ugly. And so she had to have the conversation with him of, well, what does ugly mean? And he's like, well, big ears. And she's like, well, who says they're big, right? Like, what do you mean by that? They're bigger. Sure, they're different shape than others, but they're not, anyway. So they continued this conversation, but just get curious with your child. What do you mean by that? Okay. And most of our thoughts, whether we're adults or kids, are stories. They're not based on facts. They're stories, right? I'm not good enough. Okay. Great. It's easy to say that in our minds, but what's the evidence? Well, I'm not showing up for my child. Okay, that doesn't mean you're not good enough. You're just, the fact of what you just said is I'm not showing up for my child. But we take that and we pull it all together and create these stories about ourselves. And some of these stories are based on how we were raised and the language and what people or parents were saying around us. And so I want the kids to understand, like that's the conversation you're going to have with your child. Where is it coming from? And understanding their thoughts, right? Like, okay, is that from one little moment? Like, what's the moment that led to you saying you're stupid? Okay, you got a bad grade. Right. So let's say it as a fact. I got a bad grade. That is true. You being stupid? What's the other evidence that you have, right? Well, I struggle at math overall. Great. What about your other subjects? Right. And so that's what leads to the conversation of kind of moving them away from, again, that lens of zooming into that one thing. I'm dumb because, or I'm stupid because. Okay, let's open up that lens. Let's zoom out a little bit and see what the big picture is. That thinking, when you support your child that way, that will become their inner voice later on. And then they might get stuck in a moment when they're in their 20s and it's not going well at work, right? Like maybe they're going to say, wow, I'm really dumb and I can't do this. I thought I'd be good at this job, but I'm not. Well, hopefully through the language that we instilled in them, by that time they'll say, okay, oh yeah, I'm zooming in again. How do I zoom out? Okay, this one assignment, I really bombed it. I didn't do well on this assignment that my boss asked me to hand in. Okay, but all the other ones are going well. So let me just go back to look at the other assignments and see how I can change this one. That's the internal dialogue we want them to have.
And I got 20 other things I want to talk about. We'll have to do this again. I just could talk for a couple hours, but I'll end with one final question here.
Yeah.
And that is because a lot of the negative adult behavior that produces problems like people pleasing, fear of failure, poor emotional regulation is kind of forged, it sounds like, in childhood. So from your perspective, what's the most powerful thing a father can do to model today to give his kids a better foundation for their future?
There's a lot, but
Ended with a big one.
Yeah, I know. That's a good question though. That could be a whole podcast episode.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. If we bring it back to everything that we spoke about today.
Yeah, maybe like a habit or something they could do.
Yeah, I think coming back to every situation before you react, before you say something to your child, before you say something to your wife or, a colleague, just create a habit of pausing right in your mind. And it's not about going through the whole conversation, but that habit of pause allows you can reflect in 3 seconds. You could reflect a lot. And you could, as you build the skills of the awareness, when you pause, you're able to say, it's not about me right now. Like my kid needs me. Or we try to correct right away with our child and like, but how about connection? And so when you pause, you're going to connect with maybe yourself and say, okay, this, my manager is mad at me, is mad right now, but it's not about me. I think they had a hard day. Just it's in 3 seconds, so much can happen. And it's going to lead to you not reacting right away. It's going to lead to you not shutting down and maybe getting curious in terms of what the other person needs from you. If you're, my brother, they just had their second child in like under 18 months. So I don't know. It's not
It's a
easy, right?
lot.
And it's a lot. And so in that moment, we were speaking and he was saying how easy it is to get into a lot of conflict with your partner because everybody's tired. Everybody's
Yeah.
tired. You have a toddler in the home. You have a newborn who's screaming. The toddler is adjusting. And so it's very easy to get into conflict and to think like that person hates me. This is the worst relationship right now. But if you pause and you just say, I'm tired. That's it. Maybe that's your pause in that moment. Then you'll know that you won't show up in the way that you want to, but you can do your best. Or you might pause and say, she's tired. And so you might show up a little bit differently just by pausing and saying that one sentence in your mind. But it truly, especially with our kids, don't correct right away, connect first. And maybe that'll help you see that there's a lot more to the story with your child, like in that moment.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That just flew by. Like I said, I could talk
I
for
know.
another hours. I got so much stuff to talk about.
Well, it means we get to see each other again soon.
Yeah. And you got so much amazing stuff to offer. You've got a business, you've got products and all kind of stuff, groups. It sounds like because there's tons of guys in my listenership could benefit from what you have to offer. So what can they sign up for?
Thank you. Yeah. Well, I have the podcast where I bring in researchers and clinicians, or I just share a study sometimes. So it's called the Reflective Parenting Podcast. And that stems from the new program that we launched last year called the Reflective Parent Club. In a few weeks, I will be pulling out. So there's the club where we meet every week. There are moms and dads from over 20 countries that are part of this. But there's a course embedded in the club, which I'm going to be pulling out. And this course is a 12-week course. So in a few weeks, parents could dads can buy just the course if they want to do it on their own, where I cover what it is to build self-awareness. I walk parents through that to help them because it's not easy, building the self-awareness. So I want dads to at least have a space where they can do that and then learn emotion regulation skills, which is part of it, and then learn conflict resolution skills, which is another part of what we learn inside the Reflective Parent Club. But I that's how they can learn from me. And I think, I always have blog posts on curiousneuron.com as well, and the Instagram curious_neuron. But my goal, hopefully by the next time we talk, we launched our pilot project where I'm integrating Curious Neuron into pediatric clinics, because my whole mission is that we are neglecting parents and their well-being, and the person that matters the most beside that child when they're going to their checkups is the parent, and we're not asking them enough questions and supporting them, moms and dads. And so I'm hoping that through this pilot project, which is in 3 countries right now, that we can continue growing that and being the resource, for parents. This is not parenting advice. It's truly well-being, and hopefully we can make a difference with that.
Amazing. So I'll get some links from you, and everything will be in the description of this episode. So her Instagram profile and anything she has to offer, we'll put in the description. So make sure everyone, you check that out. Thank you so much, and we'll
Thank you.
definitely get the next one on the books.
Thanks.